The agreement, as it stands, completely unacceptable. Russia won't accept it. However, Russia is going to approach this in a very Russian way, which is they're going to welcome the opportunity to negotiate and continue talks with Washington. And I think the language from Laurel will be something along the lines, in hopes of achieving a just, solution that will serve the interests of both countries. Very diplomatic language. But if if you got Sergey aside, drinking a beer, you go, this is a non-starter, they don't understand. The West is still not listening to us. Now that said, when you go through the 28 different points, it shows at least somebody on the U.S. side. This was not a casual, cavalier effort. There was some thought given to it. There's at least some understanding of what some of the issues are at the table. Use diplomatic language, but behind closed doors, they see this agreement as a non-starter. And the real issue is the same one we've seen for years. Washington talks, but it doesn't listen. Yes, the 28-point proposal shows. Does someone in the U.S. finally put real thought into this? But until the West accepts Russia's security concerns as they see them, not as we wish they were, negotiations will stay stuck in the same loop. When you go through the document, it is clearly written from a U.S. perspective, not taking into account what Putin and the foreign ministry and the military and other political leaders have said for quite some time, that look, the Russia's got these interests. Putin laid those out very clearly on June 14th, 2024. And if nothing else, those interests not only have not changed, but Dnipropetrovsk. They're going to take Kharkiv. They'll take Sumy, probably Poltava. And then they'll give the people in those regions the chance to vote on whether or not they want to join the Russian Republic. In simple terms, this is the core misunderstanding. Washington keeps writing proposals from its own worldview while ignoring what Moscow has been saying openly for years. Putin laid out Russia's red lines in 2024, and none of them have changed. If anything, they've hardened. And when a great power feels unheard, it doesn't compromise. It expands. That's why he's warning about places like Dnipro, Kiev, and Sumy. It's not bluff. It's leverage. If Russia's stated security interests aren't respected, they'll redraw the map themselves and then let the people decide where they belong. But, one of the craziest things in this document was item number 6, says the size of the... Well, look, when the special military operation started, the total size of the Ukrainian military was estimated to be 260 to 280,000 active duty. They probably had another 600,000, 700,000 reservists, but we're talking active duty. When Russia and Ukraine met in Istanbul in March of 2022, the Russians said, "Okay, here's the peacetime cap for your active duty military personnel, 85,000. So here's the U.S. saying, Oh no. Well, 600,000. And basically 7 times, what Russia, almost 8 times what Russia was willing to live with in 2022. They're not going to agree to that. I mean, so that's just one example of what I call Western delusional thought when it comes to this. However, it's a point to be discussed, and Russia will come back in and say, well, no, this look, 600 into delusion. Washington proposes a 6 lakhs man Ukrainian army when Russia already made it clear in 2022 that 85,000 was their limit. In simple terms, the U.S. is negotiating from imagination, not reality. And until they align with what Moscow actually sees as acceptable, talks won't move anywhere. This may actually have been the intent behind this, to create a U.S. proposal, very specific, that on the surface appears to be reasonable and offers at least the possibility that Russia might accept it, in order to force Ukraine's hand, that when Zelensky says, hell no, we're not going to do that, then it gives Trump to say, okay, we've tried everything to, come up with an agreement, and the ones who are preventing it from happening, are the Ukrainians. So we're done. That's one thing I heard repeatedly in Moscow from multiple sources. The military support, the sharing of intelligence, and the provision of weapons and ammunition. Ukraine's done. They can't sustain it. In simple terms, this looks less like a real peace plan and more like a setup. Washington drafts a proposal that seems reasonable, knowing Kiev will reject it. Then the U.S. can turn around and say, we tried. Ukraine refused. And that lines up with what people in Moscow keep repeating. The war ends the moment the U.S. steps out, without American intelligence, weapons, and CIA involvement. Ukraine simply can't sustain the fight. Right now, the math numbers tell the story. The casualties per month, according to Russian Ministry of Defense, killed and wounded 40,000 a month. And it's been that way for the last 4 or 5 months at least. No, actually, it's been that way. It's been that way through all of 2025. Wounded on the Ukrainians in just 2025. Then these very, very pro-Ukrainian sites, Atlantic Council, Institute for the Study of War, they're estimating that the number of desertions, monthly desertions in Ukraine, are between 20 and 40,000. Well, put those two numbers together. At a minimum, we're talking 60,000 losses per month. At the high end, 80,000 losses per month. And then you step back and say, well, how many new recruits is a Ukraine routing up every month? About 25,000, maybe. And those 25,000 aren't being sent to a training camp where they're spending 3 to 6 months in training. Good God. They're so desperate. They're slapping uniforms on them, giving them guns. They don't even know how to march in formation, and shoving them off to the front. The math is brutal. Russia 25,000 new recruits, most barely trained. In simple terms, Ukraine is losing people far faster than it can replace them. Russia is open. They'd like to have normal relationship with Washington. Normal in terms of Cold War normal, where we had diplomats in each other's capitals. We had direct flights that you could fly to Moscow from New York or Washington, D.C. So you would talk. You didn't agree, for God's sake. 'Cause there was ample areas of, where the war almost went hot. We were fighting Soviet expansion as we saw it in Central America and Angola and Afghanistan. And the Soviets, you're fighting what they saw is U.S. subversion attempts to infiltrate and destroy Russia. So it was that back and forth. Yet with all that back and forth, you still talked. Even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there are a lot of very simple things that Donald Trump could do that could put the diplomatic relations on a normal track. In simple terms, Russia isn't asking for friendship, just a return to basic Cold War normally. Direct flights, diplomats in each other's capitals, and channels that stay open, even when tensions rise. The irony is that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the two sides still talked. Today, we can't even manage that. And the truth is, a few simple diplomatic steps from Washington could reset the relationship overnight. 1. Re-establish direct flights from the United States to Moscow, vice versa. Having done that, return the property that Barack Obama seized from the Russians, illegally. Return that to them. So, and lift this ban on Russians only being able to travel 25 miles from Washington, D.C. I mean, hell, that barely gets you north of Montgomery County, Maryland, or out into Farquhar County, Virginia. But haven't done that. And I think there is some real frustration. I detect, Maria Zakharova spoke to that. And she was genuinely frustrated by it. Like, we hear the words, but we're not seeing the actions. So the ball is really in Donald Trump's camp right now to figure out, are they going to try to normalize relations with Russia? Now the problem is, as soon as he does that, there is this element in the Democrat Party and within the Republican Party that accuse him of being a traitor, of selling out to the Russians, of surrendering to the Russians, of not being tough enough with, on and on and on. So it's like this neoconservative crowd in D.C. is so entrenched, and they've got their hooks into the think tanks, hooks into the media, hooks into the military-industrial complex, that they're not about to allow normalized relations with Russia because there's too much money to be made by continuing this conflict. In simple terms, Russia is waiting for actions, not speeches. Reopening direct flights, returning seized property, and removing travel limits are basic diplomatic steps. Yet, none have happened. And the moment Trump tries to normalize relations, the D.C. establishment will brand it betrayal. The neocon networks in politics, media, and the defense industry profit from tension, not peace. That's why diplomacy keeps stalling. Conflict is simply too profitable for them to let go. Because if you take away Russia as this enemy, that's going to justify tripling the production of Patriot missiles, etc. Then who's the United States going to? How can we justify $1 trillion+ budget? So, it's the economics of this. And you know, this this $100 million, that's chicken feed. Yeah, there's $100 million worth of corruption on the energy sector. But the actual number of into the pockets of members of the U.S. Congress, House and Senate, we're talking over $48 billion. And that's being investigated now. But frankly, because some of the people who have received that money, prominent members, prominent Republicans, and prominent Democrats, I don't see the investigation going anywhere to hold anybody accountable. Again, it's too much money that's been made. So the United States, right now, has no financial incentive to seek peace with Russia. In simple terms, this is the heart of the problem. Peace doesn't pay, but conflict does. If Washington stops treating Russia as the perpetual enemy, it becomes impossible to defend a $1 trillion defense budget. And that so-called $100 million corruption is nothing compared to what's really happened. We're talking about over $48 billion ever going to touch them. That's why nothing changes. There is no financial incentive for the U.S. to seek peace with Russia.